Hello there and welcome to life where curiosity gets comfortable, old mysteries drift back to the surface, and science takes its time. Tonight, we're heading far from the world of city lights, alarm clocks, and unfinished cups of tea. We are slipping back into an ocean so ancient that even the dinosaurs had not yet arrived, into waters filled with shapes that no human eyes would ever witness directly, and into the story of one of the strangest predators to ever carry the name shark. Not long, sleek and familiar in the way most sharks appear in our minds, but something far stranger. Something fitted with what looked, at first glance, like a circular saw made of teeth. That creature is called Helicoprion, and if that name sounds like the title of a villain in a forgotten science fiction serial, I can assure you it was very real, or at least as real as any animal can be when it lived more than 250 million years ago and left behind a fossil puzzle so strange that scientists spent decades wondering where on Earth, or rather where in the shark, its teeth were actually meant to go. Because that is the problem with meeting ancient animals through fossils. They rarely introduce themselves properly. They do not arrive with a neatly labelled diagram, a portrait, and a set of helpful notes. They leave fragments. A tooth here, a bone there, a track in the mud, bite mark on something less fortunate. Then they disappear and let us do the difficult part. And Helicoprion, I must say, did not make that job easy. It left behind a spiral of teeth so bizarre that for a long time, people could not agree whether it belonged on the nose, the tail, the back, the jaw, or some deeply inconvenient location that would make chewing a logistical nightmare. So tonight, as the day begins to loosen its grip and the world grows quieter, I would love to know where you are listening from. What part of the world is holding you right now? Is it late evening where you are with the house settling down at last? Is it one of those very early hours when everything feels unusually still, and even the refrigerator hum seems louder than it has any right to be? Or perhaps it is afternoon, and you have decided that a prehistoric shark with a rotating blade of teeth is exactly the kind of company you need. And while you settle in, there is another small and fitting question. What do you picture when you hear the word shark? It is usually something clean and familiar, isn't it? A pointed nose, rows of sharp teeth, a fin slicing above the surface, a body built like a torpedo, and a reputation sharpened by documentaries and film scores. But the deeper we go into the history of sharks, the stranger they become. The modern shark is only one version of the idea. The past was full of experiments, odd bodies, odd mouths, odd strategies. It was less a tidy catalogue and more a workshop full of rough drafts, wild revisions, and at least a few moments where evolution appeared to lean back, squint at its work and say, let's try something genuinely weird. If you find this kind of slow wander through deep time relaxing, interesting, or simply a nice way to end the day, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this quiet little corner reach other people who enjoy falling asleep to strange animals, ancient seas, and the occasional scientific detective story involving fossilized confusion. And truly, few fossil mysteries have earned the word confusion as honestly as this one. Now, I should say at the start that Helicoprion was not a shark in exactly the same sense as the sharks swimming through our oceans today. It belonged to a broader and older group of cartilaginous fish, relatives rather than twins, part of a lineage that branched through the ancient seas in forms we're still trying to fully understand. It was a hunter, almost certainly. It was equipped with teeth, very definitely. And it lived in a time when marine life was already diverse, competitive, and often armed in ways that suggest the ocean has always been a place where being soft-bodied is a dangerous career choice. What makes Helicoprion so memorable, though, is not simply that it was old or large or predatory. Ancient oceans had no shortage of those. What sets it apart is the shape of the thing it left behind. Imagine a fossil that looks less like a mouth and more like a tightly coiled watch spring made of triangular teeth. A spiral, a whorl, a curling structure with each tooth nested in sequence, one after another, as though the animal had somehow swallowed a circular saw and decided to keep using it. It is one of those fossils that stops people mid-sentence. You look at it and immediately begin asking the wrong questions with complete confidence. Is it a defensive weapon, a tail spike, a jaw ornament, a feeding tool, a prank from geology? That last one is unfair to geology, though I admit the thought has occurred to many people in spirit, if not in print. And there is something very pleasing about a fossil that refuses to behave. We tend to imagine science as a steady march from mystery to certainty, as if each discovery arrives in perfect condition and slots neatly into place. In practice, it is often more like finding one piece from a jigsaw puzzle, discovering it appears to belong to 3 different puzzles at once, and then having to argue politely about whether it is upside down. Helicoprion became exactly that kind of problem. A single strange structure, preserved far better than the rest of the animal, began one of the more unusual debates in paleontology. Scientists knew it mattered. They knew it belonged to something remarkable. They just could not agree on how remarkable or in what direction. To appreciate how strange that is, it helps to remember how sharks usually replace their teeth. Many modern sharks grow row after row, shedding old teeth and moving new ones forward as needed. It is an efficient system, and rather practical if your lifestyle involves biting into things that may struggle, thrash, crunch, or occasionally bite back. But Helicoprion did not seem to follow that simple conveyor belt arrangement. Its teeth were not found scattered in rows. They were preserved in a spiral, with newer teeth growing into a curling sequence instead of being shed away in the usual fashion. That single fact was enough to turn a normal question like, "What did this fish eat?" into a much harder one, because before you can figure out what an animal was doing with its mouth, it helps enormously to know where the mouth was and how it worked. For a long time, people did not. There is also, I think, a special charm to the Permian world that Helicoprion inhabited. It is not as famous in popular imagination as the Age of Dinosaurs. It does not get the same immediate recognition. You say Jurassic and people picture giant reptiles without much effort. You say Permian and even well-educated minds sometimes pause politely and hope context will arrive soon. Yet the Permian was one of the most important stretches of life's history. A vast span of time when ecosystems were being built, tested and remade on land and in sea. It was a world of unfamiliar lineages and serious biological ambition. Long before tyrannosaurs, long before mammoths, long before anything remotely human, the planet was already full of creatures living complicated lives, solving practical problems, and evolving forms that seem from our distance both brilliant and slightly unhinged. Helicoprion belonged to that older drama. It swam through marine environments where shelled cephalopods drifted and darted, where other fishes cruised through dim water, and where survival depended on finding food, avoiding becoming food, and doing both efficiently enough to pass on your peculiar genes. Somewhere in that setting, a lineage of cartilaginous fish developed this extraordinary spiral tooth arrangement. That alone tells us something important. No matter how odd it looks to us, it worked. Evolution is not in the habit of preserving pure decoration in the machinery of the mouth, especially not in a predator or active feeder. Teeth are expensive things to grow. A mouthful of nonsense is not generally a winning strategy. So if Helicoprion carried what appears to be a circular blade of teeth, then at some point that blade was useful. It solved a problem. It processed prey. It did a job well enough for the animal's lineage to continue. The trouble is that nature does not bother to leave us instruction manuals. It just leaves the hardware and lets us argue over the intended use. That is why the story of Helicoprion is not only about an ancient fish. It is also about the slow, stubborn way human beings learn from incomplete evidence. There is a tempting myth that fossils speak plainly, but they do not. They whisper. Sometimes they mumble through stone. Sometimes they produce one perfect tooth and absolutely nothing else. Cartilaginous fish make this worse by being built largely from cartilage rather than dense bone. Bone fossilizes more readily. Cartilage is less cooperative. So when we go looking for ancient relatives of sharks, we often do not find a complete body laid out for inspection. We find the durable bits, especially teeth, which means that the mouth often survives better than the rest of the animal. In the case of Helicoprion, the mouth not only survived, it survived in a form so odd that it became a riddle in its own right, and perhaps that is part of why it captures the imagination so easily. Some prehistoric animals are impressive in a straightforward way, very large, very dangerous, very well armed. You hear the description and immediately know where to place them in your mental cabinet of ancient beasts. Helicoprion does not fit so neatly. It feels like a challenge thrown at your expectations. You think you know what a shark is, and then the fossil record slides this spiral toward you across the table and waits for your expression to change. Mine certainly did the first time I saw it. There is something almost comical about the first encounter. You look, you pause, then you think, that cannot be right. But it is right. Not simple, not fully solved for a long time, but real. The teeth really did grow in a coiled arrangement. The fossil really did lead to decades of debate. The animal really did swim through prehistoric seas carrying one of the strangest feeding structures ever evolved by a fish. It is the sort of reality that reminds you the natural world does not need our approval to be inventive, and the more one sits with that, the more enjoyable the whole subject becomes. Because once you accept that ancient life was under no obligation to resemble modern life in clean, familiar ways, a door opens. Sharks can become stranger. Seas can become less predictable. Evolution can seem less like a ladder and more like a sprawling workshop floor scattered with successful experiments, failed designs, and a few masterpieces of specialized engineering. Helicoprion belongs in that room, not because it was a mistake, quite the opposite, because it was so specialized that we, at first, struggled to recognize the logic. It is easy to forget that something can be both bizarre and sensible at once. We often treat those as opposites. Yet many of nature's oddest structures are simply solutions tailored to very specific conditions. A giraffe's neck would look absurd if you did not know the animal. A star-nosed mole would be difficult to defend aesthetically. The bill of a platypus still looks as if several committees disagreed and no one wanted to restart the paperwork. But each of these forms works in context. The question is never merely why is it strange? It is strange for what purpose? With Helicoprion, that question leads us into feeding mechanics, fossil interpretation, ancient ecology, and the habits of scientists who refuse to leave a good mystery alone, which in my opinion is one of the better habits science has to offer. There is also a pleasant humility in this story. We like to imagine that with enough intelligence and enough instruments, the past will surrender its secrets quickly. Sometimes it does. Sometimes, though, it hands us a spiral of teeth and waits a century. That is not failure. That is simply the scale of the task. To reconstruct a vanished animal from hard remnants is already difficult. To do it when the animal was made mostly of cartilage, and when the most obvious fossil seems almost too peculiar to be believable, is harder still. Yet people kept looking. They compared specimens. They proposed models. Some of those models were wrong, even gloriously wrong, but that is part of the process too. A wrong answer can still be useful if it sharpens the question. Helicoprion invites exactly that kind of patience. It asks us to resist the rush toward a neat summary. It asks us to spend a little time with uncertainty, to enjoy the fossil as a mystery before treating it as a conclusion, because the real pleasure of paleontology is not just in naming a creature or placing it on a branch of the evolutionary tree. It is in learning how much thought, comparison, revision, and careful skepticism goes into saying anything honest about a life form that vanished before mammals had even begun to dominate the land. And there is comfort in that slower pace tonight. No urgency, no need to solve everything at once. Just an old sea, an old fish, a strange mouth, and the long human effort to understand what exactly we are looking at. So picture it now. Not a modern ocean with dolphins cutting clean arcs through sunlit water and ships grumbling across the surface, but a far older marine world. The coastlines were different. The continents were arranged differently. The familiar cast of sea life had not yet assembled into the patterns we know. In those waters moved a fish, with a body we still piece together from fragments, carrying inside its jaw a coiled arrangement of teeth that would later puzzle museums, paleontologists, illustrators, and anyone with the good sense to stare at the fossil for more than 5 seconds. It did not know it was unusual, of course. No animal does. To Helicoprion, this was simply the equipment it had, the mouth it fed with, the machinery that made sense in the ecological world around it. That is another useful reminder. The weirdness is ours, not its own. The animal was not designed to impress future humans. It was shaped to live, to find prey, to process food, to survive in the conditions of its time. The fact that it also manages to unsettle our assumptions about sharks is a bonus, though a very entertaining one. Soon enough we're going to move closer to the fossil itself and ask what made this creature stand apart so sharply from the sharks we think we know. We will look at the famous tooth whorl, the problem it posed, and the broader question of what kind of animal could carry such an arrangement and make practical use of it in a real ocean full of real prey. Because before we can understand the spiral, we need to meet the fish a little more properly, and once we do, the picture gets stranger in a very specific and surprisingly logical way. When most people hear the word shark, the mind reaches for something familiar. A pointed snout, a neat line of teeth, a body shaped like a torpedo and built with the kind of confidence that suggests it has been doing this job for a very long time. Modern sharks, even with all their variety, still fit within that general picture. Some are bulky, some are slim, some cruise near the bottom, some cut through open water, and some look permanently dissatisfied with the state of the ocean. But even the odd ones still read as sharks to us. We recognise the plan. Helicoprion does not behave quite so politely. At first glance it seems to belong to that same world. It was a cartilaginous fish, part of that broad ancient company of animals related to sharks and rays, equipped with a streamlined body for life in the sea and armed with teeth that clearly meant business. In that sense, it was not some total outsider. It was not a lobster pretending to be a fish or a squid having an identity crisis. It came from a lineage of marine predators and active feeders that already understood the basic rules of ocean survival. Swim efficiently, find food, process food, try very hard not to become food for something larger and hungrier. A solid set of goals, honestly. And yet, the deeper we look, the less Helicoprion resembles the tidy shark image most of us carry around. This was not a great white with a cosmetic issue. It was not a tiger shark that had briefly gone through a strange architectural phase. It belonged to a more ancient and unusual branch of cartilaginous fishes, one with its own designs, its own experiments, and its own ideas about what a mouth might reasonably look like. The result is an animal that feels, even now, slightly unsettling to picture, not because it was impossible, but because it forces us to let go of the clean mental outline we usually place around the word shark. That is one of the quiet tricks of prehistory. It keeps reminding us that modern animals are not the whole story. They are the survivors, the current edition, the forms still in circulation. But if you go far enough back, especially into the Paleozoic seas, the world starts to look less like a finished catalogue and more like a long-running workshop. Different lineages were trying different solutions. Some of those solutions led toward body plans we still recognise. Others went off in stranger directions, and Helicoprion, I have to say, did not choose the modest path. To understand how unusual it was, it helps to step back and look at shark relatives more generally. Cartilaginous fishes are named for the material that forms most of their skeletons. Instead of dense bone, they are built largely from cartilage, the same flexible substance that gives shape to your nose and ears, although I should add that the comparison becomes less charming when the cartilage in question belongs to a large marine predator. Cartilage is lighter than bone, and it serves these animals very well. Sharks, rays, and their relatives have been enormously successful for hundreds of millions of years. which is rather strong evidence that they did not blunder into the design by accident. But cartilage creates a problem for paleontologists. Bone fossilizes more readily. Cartilage does not always preserve so generously. That means ancient cartilaginous fishes often leave behind incomplete records. Teeth survive. Hard mineralized structures survive. The rest may vanish or appear only in rare, fortunate conditions. So when we talk about Helicoprion, we're already dealing with an animal that comes to us through fragments. We do not get the luxury of meeting it in full the way we might with a beautifully preserved dinosaur skeleton. We have to reconstruct it from partial remains, and the most memorable of those remains happens to be one of the strangest dental arrangements ever found. Even without getting too far ahead of ourselves, that already tells you something important. If the most famous part of an animal is its teeth, and those teeth appear in a spiral that looks like someone rolled up a row of steak knives, then this is not going to be a routine shark. There is another reason Helicoprion stands apart. Modern sharks replace their teeth in a way that is, from an engineering point of view, wonderfully practical. New teeth form in rows behind older ones and move forward as older teeth are lost. It is a conveyor system, a production line, very efficient for an animal whose feeding style may involve biting into prey, bone, shell, or anything else that resists being eaten with dignity. Teeth are disposable tools. Lose one, grow another. No fuss. No committee meeting required. Helicoprion seems to have played by different rules. Its teeth were not shed and replaced in quite the same simple rows. Instead, they accumulated in a growing whorl, with new teeth added continuously in a spiral formation. That alone makes it unlike the sharks most people know. Imagine if your own teeth did not arrive, wear down, and depart in a fairly orderly arrangement, but instead kept forming into a curling scroll inside your mouth. Dentists would be much more dramatic people than they already are. Now, one might reasonably ask why evolution would do such a thing. Why turn a serviceable shark mouth into what appears to be a mechanical hazard? Why not stick with rows? Rows are clear, rows are dependable. Rows do not inspire museum visitors to lean in and say, surely that cannot have gone where I think it went. But evolution is not trying to make things intuitive for future observers. It is responding to immediate practical pressures. If a spiral tooth arrangement solved a feeding problem better than a standard row of replaceable teeth, then that is what would be favoured, however odd it might look to us later in a fossil case. And that, I think, is where Helicoprion becomes so interesting. Its oddness is not random. It is functional oddness, the kind that tells you an animal was interacting with its environment in a particular way, probably targeting particular prey, probably handling food with a specialised set of movements. Strange anatomy usually comes with a reason, even if the reason is buried under millions of years of missing cartilage and scientific debate. In life, Helicoprion was likely a fairly large animal, perhaps in the range of several metres long, though exact estimates vary because, as ever, the fossil record has not made this entirely straightforward. It was not a tiny curiosity drifting unnoticed through the sea. It was a substantial fish, an active swimmer, and almost certainly a predator or at least a specialised feeder on other marine animals. Its body is often reconstructed as long and streamlined, somewhat shark-like in the broad sense, with a pronounced tail built for movement through open water, not a bottom-dwelling oddball inching around in embarrassment, but a creature comfortable in the water column, moving with purpose. That body plan matters because it tells us Helicoprion was not weird all over. This is important. We sometimes hear about a bizarre fossil and begin to imagine the whole animal as a sort of carnival of impractical features, but evolution is usually more restrained than that. Most organisms are ordinary in many respects and unusual in one or two that matter. Helicoprion seems to have had a relatively sensible fish body paired with an extraordinary mouth, which, if you think about it, is often how specialization works. You do not need to reinvent the whole animal, you just need to modify the relevant hardware, and the relevant hardware here was very relevant indeed. It is useful to remember too that ancient seas were full of shelled animals, soft-bodied prey, and fast-moving marine organisms that presented different challenges to a hunter. Some prey were slippery, some were armoured, Some could dart away. Some could probably be eaten only if you could grip, cut, or slice them effectively. A specialized feeding apparatus could open a niche that more conventional mouths handled less efficiently. That is often how evolution rewards the unusual, not by making an animal universally superior, but by making it very good at one particular job. Helicoprion may have been one of those specialists, not the all-purpose shark of modern imagination, but a fish with a very particular feeding system matched to the prey available in Permian seas. That possibility immediately sets it apart from the sleek generic shark silhouette floating through popular culture. It was not just another predator with sharper teeth. It may have been an animal built around a specific method of capturing and processing food, a method so unfamiliar to us that it took generations of scientists to work out the mechanism. There is a broader point here about prehistoric animals and our tendency to compare them too quickly to modern ones. Comparison is useful. It gives us a starting place. If you say an extinct fish was shark-like, people can picture something in the right general category. But comparison can also become a trap. It encourages us to smooth away differences, to treat ancient creatures as versions of modern animals with a few cosmetic oddities. Helicoprion resists that. It reminds us that related does not mean interchangeable. Ancient cartilaginous fishes occupied ecosystems very different from today's oceans, and they often evolved forms that have no exact modern parallel. They were kin, not copies. This is one reason the fossil record of cartilaginous fish can be so maddening and so fascinating at the same time. Teeth tell us a lot, but they can also mislead if we force them into modern expectations. A spiral-toothed whorl inside a prehistoric fish might tempt us to think in terms of modern shark jaws, modern tooth replacement, modern feeding behaviour. But Helicoprion was not obligated to fit neatly into those categories. It was doing its own thing, in its own time, under its own ecological pressures. The challenge for science was to stop asking, how does this fit our idea of a shark, and start asking, what kind of animal would make sense with this anatomy? That shift took time. Quite a lot of time, in fact. And in the meantime, Helicoprion developed a reputation as one of paleontology's great dental absurdities. Still, even before the puzzle of the tooth whorl was solved, the fossil made one thing clear. This was an animal unlike the standard pattern. It had a feeding structure that did not match modern shark mouths. It belonged to a group of ancient fish that had already branched away from the line leading to today's familiar species. And it was living proof that marine evolution had produced forms far stranger than most people imagine when they hear the word prehistoric. Perhaps this is why Helicoprion tends to linger in the mind. It does not merely add another species to the list, it changes the tone of the list. Before you meet it, prehistoric sharks might seem like earlier versions of something we already understand. After you meet it, the whole category becomes more open-ended. You begin to suspect that the ancient ocean was full of creatures that would have looked normal to each other and deeply improbable to us. And there is a certain pleasure in that realization. Modern oceans are already full of animals that seem designed by committees with competing priorities. Goblin sharks, with their extendable jaws and unsettling facial arrangements, are not exactly modest. Sawfish carry their own hardware store out front. Manta rays look like underwater aircraft. The ocean has never been timid about design. But the ancient ocean had even more room for experiments, and Helicoprion sits comfortably among the best of them, or perhaps the strangest, which in this case may be the same thing. We should also talk about the name for a moment, because it has a certain efficiency to it. Helicoprion comes from Greek roots referring to a spiral or coil and a saw, which is refreshingly direct, really. No false advertising there. Once the tooth whorl was recognised as the defining feature, the name practically introduced the problem on its own. A spiral saw, the sort of name that sounds dramatic until you realise the fossil fully earns it. And yet, for all the drama, Helicoprion was not some monstrous impossibility. It was a real fish in a real ecosystem. It had to swim, feed, grow, and reproduce. It had to make practical use of its anatomy every day of its life. That grounded fact matters. When anatomy becomes highly unusual, there is a temptation to turn the animal into a spectacle, as though it existed merely to astonish. But no organism lives as a spectacle, it lives as a working system. If Helicoprion had a spiral of teeth, then that spiral had to function reliably enough to justify its existence. It had to be more than eye-catching. It had to be useful. This is why its strangeness is so valuable scientifically. Extreme features tend to reveal ecological commitments. A specialized beak, claw, tooth, or jaw tells you an animal was not simply drifting through the world opportunistically. It was doing something repeatedly enough that selection shaped its body around the task. In Helicoprion's case, that task almost certainly involved gripping and slicing prey in a distinctive way. Perhaps soft-bodied cephalopods, or similar marine animals that required a particular kind of oral machinery. It was not a general-purpose bite, it was a system. That system, though, was hidden inside one of the least cooperative fossil records available. Which brings us back to how much of Helicoprion has always been an exercise in careful imagination guided by evidence. Scientists had teeth, they had comparisons to related species, they had geology, context, and eventually scanning technology far beyond anything available to earlier generations. But for a long while, they did not have the comfort of a complete, obvious answer. They had a shark relative unlike any other, with a mouth unlike any other, and the task of fitting that into a coherent biological picture. If anything, this made Helicoprion even more distinct. Plenty of extinct animals are unusual. Fewer become famous because no one can agree where the teeth go, and perhaps there is something fitting about that. The very feature that made Helicoprion biologically special was also the feature that made it historically difficult to understand. Its uniqueness was built right into the evidence. A more conventional shark relative might have slipped quietly into the fossil record, been described, catalogued, and admired mainly by specialists. Helicoprion refused that quieter fate. Its anatomy practically demanded attention. It invited confusion, diagrams, debates, revisions, and eventually a much sharper understanding of what this animal really was. By then it had become more than a fossil. It had become a lesson. A reminder that ancient life was capable of solving problems in ways modern life does not always preserve. A reminder that evolution is under no obligation to repeat itself, and a reminder that the phrase prehistoric shark can hide far more variety than the public usually suspects. So when we say Helicoprion was a shark unlike any other, that is not just a bit of colourful phrasing, it is nearly the whole point. It was unlike the typical shark body in its lineage, unlike the modern shark jaw in its dental arrangement, unlike the tidy expectations we tend to place on marine predators. It looked familiar enough to draw us in, then strange enough to force us to pay attention. And once you do pay attention, the real mystery starts to sharpen, because it is one thing to know that Helicoprion was unusual. It is another thing entirely to stare at the fossil evidence and ask how anyone was supposed to make sense of that spiral in the first place. What made Helicoprion truly difficult to understand was not just that it was strange. Prehistory is full of strange things. It was that the strangest part of it arrived first, and arrived alone, like a clue from a mystery that had misplaced the rest of the evidence. Paleontologists did not begin with a full skull laid out neatly in stone. They did not begin with a complete body showing fins, tail, jaws, and all the tidy context one might wish for on a long afternoon in a museum basement. They began, in most cases, with the spiral itself, a tight coil of teeth, nested one after another in a curling sequence, preserved far more clearly than the rest of the fish that carried it. And that is how the trouble started. It is one thing to find a tooth. Teeth are common enough in the fossil record that they almost behave like seasoned professionals. They show up, survive the ages, and give paleontologists just enough information to begin sounding confident. A shark tooth, for example, can often tell you something about diet, something about lineage, and at least a little about attitude. A serrated triangular tooth suggests one style of feeding. A needle-like tooth suggests another. Even when the rest of the skeleton is missing, a tooth still feels familiar. It belongs to a language science already speaks. A spiral of teeth is another matter. Imagine brushing dust away from stone and finding what looks like a tightly coiled roll of triangular blades. Not a neat row. Not a jaw with obvious left and right sides. Not the sensible arrangement one expects from a vertebrate mouth. Just a curve becoming a spiral becoming a whorl, and teeth set into that curl in such a way that your first reaction is not clarity, but suspicion. It looks too deliberate to be an accident and too unusual to fit comfortably into any ordinary fish anatomy. You would not know at once whether you were looking at something from the mouth, the head, the back, or perhaps a body part nature had kept hidden from modern design manuals for very good reason. That was essentially the situation in the late 19th century, when Alexander Kapinski described the first known Helicoprion fossil in 1899 from rocks near Krasnoufimsk in Russia. He recognized that the strange coil of teeth came from a prehistoric fish, but he did not know exactly where it belonged. His proposed reconstruction placed the whorl projecting from the snout and curling back over the head, with the teeth pointing outward like an exposed circular weapon. It was bold, memorable, and as it turned out, not correct, though one can hardly blame him. If the fossil record hands you a spiral saw and no obvious instruction booklet, you are going to have to improvise. There's something almost charming about those early interpretations, not because they were right, but because they reveal how science actually behaves when it meets the unfamiliar. It does not always glide smoothly toward the answer. Sometimes it circles, it proposes, it argues. It sketches creatures that later generations look at with a mixture of admiration and second-hand embarrassment. Helicoprion inspired exactly that kind of historical parade. Once the tooth whorl entered scientific conversation, people began trying to fit it somewhere, anywhere, that seemed remotely plausible. If it was not on the snout, perhaps it sat in the upper jaw. If not there, then maybe the lower jaw, or a fin, or the tail, or in some proposals even farther back in the throat, where it could have served some deeply specialized function that was not yet clear. For decades, the fossil behaved less like an answer and more like a test of scientific imagination. And to be fair, the fossil gave people very little help. Cartilaginous fish are difficult customers when they enter the realm of paleontology. Bone fossilizes with more generosity. Cartilage is far less dependable. Sharks and their relatives often leave behind teeth, scales, and other mineralized structures, but not the sort of clean, complete skeleton that would settle a debate with proper efficiency. Helicoprion followed that pattern. Most known specimens were tooth whorls, teeth embedded in a spiraled root, while the surrounding skeletal material either did not preserve well or remained obscured inside the rock. So the central mystery was not merely, what is this? It was, what is this doing in the body and where is the rest of the body when you need it? This is the kind of paleontological problem that can stretch on for years, because every new fossil seems to answer one question while quietly introducing three more. A spiral of teeth clearly means something. It is too orderly, too repeated, too biologically expensive not to matter. Teeth are not casual decorations. Organisms do not grow elaborate dental structures merely to confuse future museum visitors. If a fish is carrying a whorl of sharpened tooth crowns in a coil, then those teeth were doing a job, and doing it often enough for natural selection to preserve the arrangement. Yet function depends on position. A blade mounted in one place behaves differently from the same blade mounted elsewhere. A structure in the mouth cuts one kind of prey. A structure on the snout suggests another role entirely. So until the location was solved, the ecology remained foggy too. That is why the debate around Helicoprion was never just a matter of anatomy. It was a question about the animal's whole way of life. Put the whorl on the snout and you imagine a bizarre weaponized fish perhaps slashing or probing in some highly unusual manner. Put it in the jaw, and now you're talking about feeding mechanics. Put it farther back, and the story changes again. Every reconstruction was really two claims at once, one about where the spiral sat, and another about how the fish lived. There is also a human tendency, whenever confronted with something genuinely alien, to force it into a familiar category. We like the comfort of known patterns. If the fossil belongs to a fish, and if fish have mouths, then surely the teeth must behave more or less as teeth usually do. But Helicoprion resisted that comforting shortcut. Its whorl did not resemble the conveyor belt tooth replacement of a modern shark. It did not match the plain dental batteries of bony fish either. The entire structure seemed to preserve growth itself, as if the animal had not shed old teeth in the ordinary way, but had continued adding new ones into a visible curling archive of its own feeding history. That detail matters because the spiral was not just an arrangement of crowns, it was a record of development. Newer teeth were added continually, and older teeth were carried forward and around as the whorl grew. In other words, the fossil was not a random jumble. It was a built sequence, an ordered machine made over time. The problem was that nobody, at first, could quite agree on how this machine was meant to be used. That uncertainty gave rise to some of the most memorable reconstructions in fossil history, many of which now look wonderfully improbable, like the efforts of very smart people trying to assemble a pocket watch after finding only the springs. In the decades that followed Kopinski's original description, different scientists proposed different placements with complete seriousness, because there was no obvious way to eliminate them. This is easy to laugh at from the comfort of hindsight, but hindsight has an unfair advantage. We know how the story turned out. They did not. They were working from scattered specimens, limited preparation methods, and an animal whose skeleton did not preserve like a cooperative dinosaur. Under those conditions, even an odd idea could remain alive for a surprisingly long time, and what a set of ideas it was. The whorl was imagined jutting from the face. It was imagined embedded in various parts of the jaw. It was imagined on fins. It was imagined in the throat. Illustrators and paleontologists kept returning to the same central obstacle. The fossil was too distinctive to ignore and too incomplete to place with confidence. That combination gave Helicoprion a long scientific afterlife as a puzzle in search of a body. The fossil itself was real enough. The question was how much of the rest of the animal had to be invented around it, while everyone waited for better evidence. There is an almost detective story quality to that waiting. Not the theatrical kind where someone dramatically reveals the culprit by the fireplace, but the quieter sort, where the case stays open on the desk for decades, and each generation adds one more note to the file, a specimen here, a comparison there, a reinterpretation of related animals. Gradually the possibilities narrow, not because one genius suddenly sees the answer in a flash, but because evidence accumulates, and the stranger guesses begin to lose ground. Helicoprion's case was helped by another important realization. It was not some isolated freak with no relatives. It belonged to a broader group of ancient cartilaginous fishes with unusual dental arrangements, often referred to as eugeniodonts. Once you stop treating the whorl as an impossible one-off and start comparing it with related forms, the anatomy becomes less like an absurdity and more like part of an evolutionary pattern. Strange, yes, but not singular. Other members of the group also had unusual tooth systems and specialized jaws. That did not solve the exact placement immediately, but it did change the mood of the inquiry. The fossil was no longer a geological prank. It was part of a lineage of animals experimenting very successfully for their time with unconventional ways of biting prey. Even so, the actual breakthrough took far longer than many people might expect. It was not until 2013 that CT scans of a key Helicoprion specimen revealed hidden cranial and jaw material still embedded in the rock, allowing researchers to reconstruct the tooth whorl with much greater confidence. Those scans showed that the spiral was not some outward-pointing snout weapon at all. It occupied the mandibular arch and sat along the midline of the lower jaw. In simple terms, the famous whorl belonged where a mouth could use it. The mystery that had stretched for more than a century finally began to close. There is something deeply satisfying about that moment, and not only because it solved the placement, it vindicated the patience of the process. The answer was not hiding in plain sight in the sense of being obvious. It was hiding in plain sight quite literally, inside the rock, waiting for better imaging methods. Earlier scientists were not foolish for missing evidence they could not yet see. They were limited by the tools of their time. That is one of the quieter lessons of the fossil record. Sometimes knowledge advances not because nature has changed its mind, but because our methods improve enough to read what was already there. Once the lower jaw placement became clear, the spiral itself started to make more biological sense. Instead of a decorative or external weapon, it could now be treated as part of a feeding mechanism. The teeth appear to have formed a symphyseal whorl, meaning they sat at the midline of the lower jaw where the two halves meet. The structure occupied the front and lower interior of the jaw in a way that would have allowed it to grasp, slice, and move prey backward as the jaws closed. Suddenly the fossil stopped looking like an anatomical joke and began to look like a very specialized tool. And this is where the spiral becomes even more interesting, because it was not just a row curled for dramatic effect. Different parts of the whorl would have interacted with prey differently. The forward teeth could catch, the middle teeth could cut. The more posterior part of the structure could help draw food inward. The whole apparatus starts to resemble a dynamic conveyor of blades, not in the modern shark style of endless replaceable rows, but in a compact rolling system that kept the older teeth in place as newer ones formed. It was a feeding device with memory. Every turn of the spiral contained the earlier history of the jaw's growth. That still leaves the fossil with its air of strangeness, of course. Solving the mystery does not make the whorl ordinary. It simply changes the kind of oddity we're dealing with. Before the CT work, the spiral seemed bizarre because it could not be placed. Afterward, it remained bizarre, but in a more grounded way. Now it was not an impossible fantasy pinned to the face of a fish. It was a real lower jaw adaptation from a real lineage of ancient marine predators. The mystery shifted from where was it to how exactly did it work so well. There is a difference between those questions. The first is a problem of location. The second is a problem of function. And function is often the more rewarding mystery, because once you know where a structure belongs, you can begin asking what kind of prey would drive such an arrangement, what jaw motion would activate it best, how the teeth grew without simply becoming an inconvenience, and why no modern animal has kept anything quite like it. Still, before we get there, I think it is worth lingering a little longer with the old confusion, because it says something valuable about the relationship between fossils and imagination. A fossil is never the whole animal. It is a filter. It preserves some things and erases others. With bone-rich animals, we often forget this because the skeleton looks so complete. With Helicoprion, the incompleteness was impossible to ignore. The spiral arrived stripped of its easy context, and scientists had to build context around it. That made the process visible. You can almost watch interpretation happening, decade by decade, in the changing reconstructions. One generation saw a snout saw, another saw a jaw structure, another entertained dorsal or other placements. Then modern imaging pulled the hidden anatomy out of the matrix and narrowed the field sharply. It is a perfect example of science not as a straight line, but as a gradual tightening of possibilities. Wrong ideas are proposed, better ones replace them, evidence improves, confidence adjusts. Nobody receives the full truth all at once. It is also, I admit, a very good reminder not to become too smug about our present reconstructions of extinct life. We know far more than Kopinski did, and the lower jaw position of the whorl is now strongly supported. But paleontology is still a field that works from fragments and inference. New fossils can refine old pictures. Better methods can overturn respectable assumptions. That is not weakness. It is simply honesty about the kind of evidence deep time gives us. And perhaps that is why the whorl of Helicoprion remains so memorable even after the basic mystery has been solved. It carries both stories at once. It is a biological structure from a peculiar ancient fish, and it is a historical object that spent more than a century confounding the people who studied it. You can look at the fossil and see an animal's feeding apparatus. You can also see the entire human struggle to understand it. The stone preserves both the teeth and the argument. For a bedtime science story, that is almost ideal. No need for loud drama. No need for exaggerated monsters leaping through the dark. Just a curled set of teeth in rock, a long-running puzzle, and generations of researchers trying to answer a basic practical question that the animal itself settled every time it ate. The fish knew perfectly well where the whorl went. It was only the mammals, arriving a geological eternity later with notebooks and scanners, who had to sort it out. And now that the placement is clearer, the spiral can finally be appreciated for what it really was. Not a decorative oddity, not a fossil prank, not a blade sprouting from the face like a truly unfortunate design choice. It was part of a working jaw. A specialised lower jaw, yes, and one unlike anything alive today, but a jaw all the same, which means the next step is the obvious one, and also the most satisfying. Once you know that the saw sat where the mouth could use it, the question becomes how a fish actually built such a thing and made it work without turning every meal into a mechanical misunderstanding. Once the tooth whorl was finally placed in the lower jaw, the whole animal stopped looking like a fossil prank and started looking like a piece of very serious engineering. The spiral was not dangling from the snout or waving from a fin like an extremely unwise ornament. It sat along the midline of the lower jaw, occupying the length of Meckel's cartilage, the main cartilage of that jaw. In practical terms, the famous circular saw was built right into the mouth where it could actually do some work. CT-based studies of a key specimen showed that the whorl was enclosed and supported by the jaw apparatus, not attached somewhere decorative and inconvenient. That matters because a jaw is not just a place where teeth happen to be. It is a moving machine. Position changes everything. A sharp structure on the face suggests one kind of life. The same structure inside the mouth suggests another. Once scientists could see the whorl in its proper place, they could stop treating Helicoprion like a bizarre riddle with teeth and start asking a more useful question. How did this fish grow a spiraled tooth battery inside its lower jaw without turning every meal into a mechanical accident? The answer, as usual in paleontology, turned out to be less theatrical and more clever. It was not a random coil of teeth. It was a growing dental system, orderly, supported and specialised. Modern sharks usually handle their teeth in a very straightforward way. New teeth form in rows behind the active ones, older teeth are shed, and replacements move forward. It is a conveyor belt arrangement, neat and efficient, and rather ideal for animals that spend their lives biting things with varying levels of cooperation. Helicoprion did not use that familiar conveyor system. Its tooth crowns were attached to a fused base that grew outward in a spiral. The whorl sat between the two halves of the lower jaw, and the visible tooth crowns projected from that continuous curling base. So instead of losing old teeth in the usual shark style, Helicoprion carried its earlier teeth forward in the expanding scroll of its own dental history. There is something wonderfully stubborn about that design. Imagine a fish deciding that simple rows are for quitters. But the growth pattern was not reckless. The oldest teeth sat deepest in the inner coil toward the centre of the spiral, where they were increasingly surrounded by encasing cartilage. The newer teeth formed farther out along the whorl, and only a portion of the outer sequence actually erupted into the mouth as the functional cutting edge. In other words, the entire spiral was not exposed like a spinning bakery display of blades. A large part of it was tucked away, with the active teeth occupying the business end while the older ones were stored deeper in the structure. That tucked-away arrangement is one reason the jaw makes more sense the longer you sit with it. From a distance, the whorl looks impractical because we imagine the whole spiral flailing about in open space. But the fossil evidence suggests a more controlled system. The exposed teeth were the outer, newer crowns, while the older inner teeth were embedded and supported. The tooth bases fused into a solid symphyseal complex at the centre of the lower jaw, giving the structure continuity rather than fragility. It was not a loose string of teeth rolling around like spare cutlery in a drawer. It was a built, supported, integrated jaw element. Odd, yes. Flimsy, no. There is also the matter of support, because a whorl like this cannot simply be left to its own devices and trusted to behave. The jaw anatomy described from the CT scanned specimen showed robust cartilaginous supports around the tooth whorl, interpreted as part of a modified labial cartilage complex. Those supporting cartilages appear to have braced the whorl and helped manage how the jaw closed. The system included structures that likely limited overclosure as well, which is reassuring for everyone involved. A fish can get away with many things, but biting through its own head is not generally a sustainable feeding strategy. The jaw had to be powerful, but it also had to stop in the right place. This is where Helicoprion starts to feel less like an odd shark and more like a custom-built cutting tool. The upper jaw does not seem to have carried a matching spiral. Instead, studies describe small, low-cusped, rounded teeth associated with the upper jaw, more like a dental surface than a second blade. That means the lower whorl was doing the dramatic part of the work, while the upper jaw provided a more subdued opposing surface. It is not unlike discovering that one half of the machine is a rotating set of sharpened hooks and cutters, while the other half is the part that holds the prey in place and helps the lower system do its job. The upper jaw, in short, was less theatrical, but it was still very much part of the plan. And now we get to the part people most enjoy imagining, the actual bite. Not a simple snap, not the standard shark chomp, but a sequence of contact points changing as the jaw moved. Biomechanical work on the jaw suggests that different teeth along the exposed part of the whorl did different jobs because of where they sat relative to the jaw joint and because of the curve of the spiral itself. The frontmost active teeth were better positioned to hook and snag prey. The middle teeth were better placed to pierce and slice. The more posterior functional teeth could help cut and push food farther into the mouth. So the whorl was not just one repeating edge, it was a sequence of tools arranged along a curve, each portion doing a slightly different task as the jaw opened and closed. That is one of the most satisfying details in the whole reconstruction, because it means the famous spiral was not merely a dramatic shape, its geometry mattered. The curvature changed the angle at which individual teeth met prey. Some teeth would contact first, others would engage later as the lower jaw continued its movement. The motion was not a flat clamp so much as a guided sweep. Researchers comparing the paths of the teeth during jaw opening and closing found that the movement could act in a soaring manner, with repeated cycles helping capture, process and transport prey farther into the mouth. That is a long way from the old image of a fish with an unexplained spiral stuck to its face. It is a controlled feeding mechanism with stages. The mechanics also suggest something else that is easy to miss when staring at the whorl as an object. Helicoprion was not relying only on tooth sharpness. It was using leverage. Because the teeth lay at different distances from the jaw joint, they experienced different mechanical advantages. Teeth closer to the joint could exert higher forces, which would help with puncturing and pushing prey inward. Teeth farther from the joint gained more speed and sweep, making them useful for snagging and drawing tissue into the mouth. It is the kind of arrangement an engineer might admire with great seriousness and then immediately sketch on a napkin during lunch. Nature, as usual, built it without filling out the paperwork. For all its reputation as a buzzsaw, though, the jaw was not spinning like a power tool in a garage. That modern image is catchy, but it can mislead. The whorl did not rotate independently the way a circular saw blade does in a machine. The cutting effect came from jaw motion, especially cyclic opening and closing, combined with the curved arrangement of the teeth. So the closer analogy is not an electrically driven blade, but a lower jaw whose geometry makes each bite act like a sweeping slice. It is still dramatic, only in a more biological and less workshop accident sort of way. There is another important point hidden in the wear patterns, or rather the lack of dramatic damage. Researchers have noted that the tooth whorl does not show the sort of extensive chipping and breakage one might expect if Helicoprion were routinely smashing through very hard shells with brute force alone. That absence helped push scientists toward a softer prey interpretation. The jaw muscles may have been capable of producing strong bite forces, but the shape of the whorl, the kind of upper dentition present, and the way prey would be handled in the mouth all suggest that the apparatus was especially effective for seizing and cutting soft-bodied animals rather than simply crushing armoured ones. This does not mean the fish was delicate, far from it. One of the more interesting outcomes of the functional work is that Helicoprion could still have generated substantial bite stresses, likely enough to cut through the tissues of fish and cephalopods, and perhaps remove soft parts from shelled prey without needing to crush the shell itself. That is a very different strategy from the obvious shell cracker. Instead of smashing the whole target, Helicoprion may have been better at catching exposed tissue, drawing it into the jaws and slicing it efficiently. It is a more precise, less blunt force approach, and in some ways more unsettling because it sounds as though the fish had a very clear idea of what part of dinner it intended to keep. The more one follows that logic, the more the whorl feels like a feeding track rather than a mere blade. Prey tissue that encountered the front of the lower jaw could be hooked and pulled in. As the jaws continued to close, the middle section could pierce and cut. Then the posterior part of the functional row could help move the food inward, deeper into the oral cavity. The whorl was therefore not only for first contact, it appears to have participated in the whole sequence from capture to processing to transport. That is a very efficient use of a single structure, and it helps explain why evolution tolerated such a strange jaw arrangement in the first place. It was not just strange, it was multitasking. This also helps answer a question that quietly bothers many people the first time they see Helicoprion. Why would the teeth keep curling inward instead of becoming useless clutter? The answer seems to be that the inner part of the spiral was not there to remain actively cutting forever. As the base grew outward and the whorl expanded, the oldest teeth became enclosed and moved out of the active biting region. The newer teeth took over the exposed functional role. So while the animal did not shed old teeth in the usual shark manner, it also did not leave every tooth active at once. It managed age through position. The spiral stored history, but only part of that history stayed on duty. There is a lovely practical logic to that. The fish was not endlessly accumulating a problem. It was building a working edge while burying the retired sections. That makes the whorl less like a runaway growth and more like a continuous manufacturing line with built-in archival storage. It is admittedly a strange archive. Most filing systems do not contain serrated triangles, but the principle is there. The older structures remain part of the base. The newer structures become the active interface with the world. Once that clicks, the whole apparatus feels less absurd and more disciplined. The fish was not burdened by its spiral. It was using the spiral exactly as intended. It also means we should be careful with the phrase circular saw for a jaw, entertaining though it is. It captures the look and part of the action, but it can hide the fact that this was a living jaw with soft tissues, supports, growth patterns, and movement constraints. It was not a hardware store object glued into an ancient fish. It was cartilage, tooth bases, erupting crowns, supportive labial structures, and a feeding cycle that likely depended on repeated motions of the lower jaw. The engineering was biological, not industrial, which to be honest is much more impressive. Engineers get manuals, evolution gets time, variation, and an alarming willingness to try things. Another thing worth appreciating is how much this reconstruction depends on not just fossils, but fossils plus method. Earlier generations could see the whorl and guess at function, but the clearer picture came from CT data, from identifying cartilage boundaries, from modelling the levers and contact points of the jaws. That is why Helicoprion now feels more understandable than it did a century ago. The fish did not become simpler. We simply got better at looking. And once we could look properly, the strange jaw stopped being nonsense and became a highly specialised feeding system, from an ancient marine predator that was, in its own setting, probably very good at what it did. There is a broader lesson in that, and it applies to a great deal of prehistory. When something in the fossil record seems ridiculous, it is often because context is missing, not because the animal was poorly designed. Helicoprion's jaw looked ridiculous when the spiral floated free of the skull in our imagination. Put it back into the lower jaw, trace how the whorl grew, note which teeth were exposed, add support cartilages, model the bite, and suddenly the design becomes coherent. Unusual, absolutely, but coherent. The fish had not made an error. We had simply met it in pieces, and once the jaw begins to look coherent, one conclusion follows almost immediately. A mouth built like this was not for random feeding, it was built for a target. A system this specialized usually points to a specific kind of prey, or at least a specific way of processing prey. The structure could hook, slice, and move food inward. It could handle soft tissue especially well. It may even have helped strip edible parts from animals that carried shells without requiring the fish to crush the shell itself. So the jaw tells us not only how Helicoprion fed, but where to look next if we want to understand its life properly. The mouth is already pointing us toward the menu, and that is where the animal becomes even more interesting. Now that the jaw has started to make sense, the obvious next question is the one every prehistoric predator eventually has to face. What exactly was all that equipment for? What was Helicoprion actually trying to catch, hold, cut, and swallow with a lower jaw that looked like a rolled-up line of knives? The honest answer is that no one has found a Helicoprion fossil lying there, with its last meal neatly preserved like an apologetic receipt. The diet has to be inferred from the jaw, the tooth whorl, the biomechanics of the bite, and the kinds of prey that make sense for a marine fish built this way. And when scientists put those pieces together, the strongest interpretation is not shell-crushing terror of absolutely everything, but a more specific feeder that was especially well suited to soft-bodied prey, very likely including squid-like cephalopods and other animals with a lot of flesh and not too much stubborn armour. That conclusion may sound slightly underdramatic at first. After all, when people hear prehistoric shark with a circular saw for a jaw, they tend to expect something that spent its life ploughing through armoured victims with all the subtlety of a dropped piano, but the jaw mechanics point in a different direction. The 2015 functional study of Helicoprion's jaws suggested that the tooth whorl was especially effective for grasping, slicing and moving prey inward during repeated jaw cycles, and the Australian Museum's summary of that work notes that reconstructions favour soft prey items such as squids, while also allowing that the apparatus could handle different prey types in different ways. In other words, this was not simply a fish that crushed whatever got in front of it. It seems to have been a fish that cut and processed prey with real specialisation. There is something quietly satisfying about that, because it means the whorl was not just dramatic, it was precise. The front teeth of the spiral were positioned to hook and drag prey inward. The middle teeth were better placed to pierce and slice. The posterior teeth helped continue the job, cutting and moving food deeper into the mouth. That is a very different feeding picture from a one-bite crusher. It is more like a sequence. First catch, then cut, then feed the prey farther in. A mouth like that makes immediate sense for soft-bodied animals that can be snagged, controlled and sliced, and rather less sense for prey that are basically all shell and inconvenience. This is also where the phrase buzzsaw can be a little misleading, however entertaining it may be. A power tool suggests brute force and a lot of shredded debris. Helicoprion seems to have been doing something more controlled than that. The jaw did not spin like a machine. The teeth met prey in a curved, staged path as the lower jaw moved. That means its best targets were probably things that could be caught in that path and cut by it, not necessarily pulverised by it. The Royal Society's summary of the CT-based work put it plainly. Helicoprion likely ate soft-tissued prey such as squid rather than specialising in hunting creatures with hard shells. That is not less impressive. It is simply a more exact kind of impressive. There is another clue in what the teeth do not show. If Helicoprion had spent its life attacking very hard-shelled prey by brute crushing, you might expect more dramatic wear, breakage, or chipping across the functional tooth crowns. Instead, the functional interpretation in the jaw study favoured a system better suited to soft-bodied prey, with hard-shelled prey tending to slip forward from the closing jaws if handled the wrong way. That detail matters because it turns the old image of Helicoprion as a shell-smashing monster into something more subtle. The fish may well have interacted with shelled animals, but the whorl was not behaving like a nutcracker, it was behaving like a guided slicing tool. So what soft-bodied prey are we really talking about? The best supported candidates are cephalopods, animals on the broader line that today include squid, cuttlefish, octopuses, and nautiluses. During the long history of cephalopods, shelled forms such as ammonoids and nautiloids were abundant in marine settings, and cephalopods as a group have a fossil history stretching back hundreds of millions of years. That makes them not only plausible prey in Permian seas, but exactly the kind of marine animals one should start thinking about when a predator's jaw seems specialised for seizing and cutting soft tissue. Helicoprion did not need to invent an eccentric mouth for nothing. The sea already provided creatures worth that trouble. Now it is worth slowing down here because cephalopod can cover a lot of ground. A fully soft-bodied squid-like animal would have been a very comfortable fit for Helicoprion's mechanics. Catch the body, grip it with the anterior teeth, slice with the middle part of the whorl, push the meal inward, simple, efficient, unpleasant if you are the squid, excellent if you are the fish. But the picture gets more interesting when shelled cephalopods enter the scene. Modern people often imagine a shell as an automatic defence, which is fair enough, but a shell is only useful if the predator has to break the shell to get the soft part. And Helicoprion may not have needed to do that every time. The jaw model leaves room for a more cunning approach. The Australian Museum summary, drawing on the 2015 functional work, notes that Helicoprion could have consumed both hard and soft-bodied prey using different feeding strategies. That is a very important sentence, and perhaps not the kind that gets enough appreciation. It does not mean the fish was equally good at all possible meals. It means the jaw was not trapped in a single narrow behaviour. The same slicing system that worked beautifully on soft-bodied prey could also have interacted with shelled prey by targeting the exposed soft tissues rather than trying to reduce the shell to gravel. For an ammonoid or nautiloid, the vulnerable part is not the shell itself, but the animal extending from it. A predator built to hook and draw soft parts inward suddenly sounds much more relevant. That possibility changes the whole meal in your mind. Instead of picturing Helicoprion biting down on a shell like someone testing a walnut with bad intentions, picture it meeting a shelled cephalopod at the opening, catching exposed tissue and using the curved lower whorl to pull, trap, and slice. The 2018 comparative work on late Paleozoic symphyseal dentitions even describes proposed prey capture behaviour in which soft parts are impaled and drawn into the oral cavity, while hard parts are pinched out or left aside. That is a much more specialised and frankly more efficient way to eat a shelled animal. You keep the edible part and skip the structural packaging, a very practical arrangement, if a little rude. And if that was indeed part of the strategy, then Helicoprion starts to look less like a generic predator and more like a specialist in the handling of awkward marine food. Not awkward in the sense of bad taste, but awkward in the sense that prey either came in slippery muscular form or arrived attached to a shell that needed to be worked around. Many predators can catch, fewer can process efficiently. Evolution often rewards the second skill just as much as the first. A fish that can turn difficult prey into manageable prey gains an advantage that has nothing to do with looking sensible to future mammals. The shape of the upper jaw also fits that picture. Rather than a mirrored blade above, Helicoprion seems to have had low, rounded upper teeth, forming more of a surface against which the lower whorl could work. That means prey would be trapped between a dramatic lower cutting structure and a more restrained upper partner. One side did the grabbing and slicing, the other side helped hold and oppose. You can almost see the food path in that design. Something soft gets caught. The lower whorl rises through its curved motion. The prey is compressed, cut, and moved inward. It is less a dramatic snap and more a guided intake system with teeth. This is also why soft-bodied fish remain possible, even if cephalopods are usually the headline. A jaw that hooks, spears, slices, and pushes prey inward would not refuse a suitably sized unarmoured fish simply because it lacked tentacles. The mechanism is not anti-fish, it is pro-soft tissue. The point is not that Helicoprion only ate one thing every day with no imagination. The point is that the best supported menu centres on prey, that rewarded cutting and inward transport more than crushing. Cephalopods fit especially well, but the system does not look so narrowly built that it could not handle other fleshy marine animals when available. That said, I would be careful not to turn maybe fish too into the main story. The strongest statements from the jaw work and museum summaries consistently push us back towards soft-bodied cephalopod prey. That is where the evidence feels most comfortable. The Royal Society summary explicitly mentions squid-like prey rather than hard-shelled prey, and the functional model described in the literature emphasises the way different sections of the whorl work together during capture and slicing. If one were choosing a poster image for Helicoprion's feeding life based on current evidence, it would not be a crushed shell. It would be a cephalopod caught at exactly the wrong moment. There is also an ecological common sense to that. Open water predators often benefit from prey that are abundant, energy-rich and accessible, with the hunting tools they already possess. Cephalopods are muscular, nutritious and active. They are not passive lumps drifting by asking to be catalogued. A predator that can seize them effectively gains access to a very respectable food source, and in a Permian sea populated by shelled and likely shell-reduced cephalopod forms, a specialised feeder with a slicing lower jaw would have had plenty of reason to keep perfecting that strategy. That is not an absolute proof of the menu, but it is a very reasonable fit between anatomy and ecology. Another point that makes cephalopods attractive as prey is the problem of escape. Soft-bodied animals in open water are often quick, flexible, and not inclined to pause while predators evaluate the situation. Catching them requires not just speed but retention. It is no use spearing something if it wriggles loose before the rest of the mouth can get involved. The front of Helicoprion's whorl appears to have been excellent for exactly that first moment of retention. Hook, pull, keep hold, then let the rest of the whorl participate. That sequence sounds almost tailor-made for prey that are slippery and active rather than rigid and crushable. And there is a kind of elegance in that specialisation. We often treat prehistoric predators as if success depended only on being larger or sharper than everything else nearby. But many of the most effective predators, ancient and modern, succeed because they match their tools closely to their prey. A heron is not impressive because it can defeat a rhinoceros. It is impressive because it is very good at being a heron. In the same way, Helicoprion did not need to dominate every edible thing in the sea. It needed to be very good at handling the kinds of prey its jaw was built for. That is often enough. More than enough really if your lineage persists for millions of years. Still, the possibility of shelled cephalopods deserves one more look, because it helps explain why the diet question has remained a little richer than a single easy sentence. If hard-shelled prey could slip from the jaws when treated as something to crush, that does not eliminate them from the menu. It simply changes the technique. A predator could attack the opening of the shell, catch the soft animal extending from it, and use the three-point interaction of upper jaw and lower whorl to trap and cut the exposed body. In that scenario, the shell is not the meal. The shell is the box the meal came in. And Helicoprion may have been quite good at opening the box by ignoring most of it. This also helps explain why the argument over diet was never truly about one prey taxon versus another, but about feeding style. Was Helicoprion a crusher, a slicer, a trapper, a shell breaker, a soft part extractor? Once the jaw was reconstructed properly, the answer began leaning strongly towards slicer and soft-part handler. That immediately favours squid-like prey, and also leaves room for pulling edible tissue from shelled cephalopods. It is a more nuanced answer than it ate ammonoids, or it ate squid. It ate in a particular way, and that way tells us what kinds of prey made sense. There is something almost annoyingly competent about that. You spend years picturing a ridiculous mouth, and then it turns out the mouth was highly organised and probably aimed at very practical prey handling problems. The fossil is still strange, certainly. But the feeding picture is not nonsense. It is one of those cases where the deeper explanation is less flashy and much more satisfying. Not monster fish destroys all shells. More specialised marine predator uses a highly unusual lower jaw apparatus to secure and process soft-bodied prey with remarkable efficiency. A less cinematic poster, perhaps, but a far better animal. And because we should be fair to the mystery, it is worth saying again that best supported is not the same as proved in every detail. Paleontology often works this way. We do not get menus printed on stone tablets. We get anatomy, context, comparison, mechanics, and careful inference. In Helicoprion's case, those lines of evidence align most convincingly around soft-bodied prey, especially cephalopods, with some flexibility for handling shelled forms by targeting their soft tissues rather than smashing their shells outright. That is a strong answer, even if it is not a magical final one. Science is allowed to be confident without pretending to be clairvoyant. So, if you picture Helicoprion now, do not imagine it aimlessly chomping at whatever wandered past. Picture a fish with a narrow, specialised mouth, a lower spiral of teeth moving through a guided slicing path, and prey that rewarded being caught in exactly that path. A squid-like animal would be in trouble very quickly. A shelled cephalopod exposing its body would be having a bad day in a more complicated way. And an unarmoured fish that drifted into the wrong encounter might also find that this was not the kind of mouth one escaped by wriggling politely. By the time you accept that menu, another picture begins to sharpen almost on its own. Not just the mouth, and not just the prey, but the setting. Because a predator's diet is never separate from its world. If Helicoprion was built to hunt and process animals like these, then the sea around it had to supply them, and that ancient sea was not an empty stage. It was a very real Permian environment full of drifting shells, moving shadows, soft-bodied swimmers, and the constant ordinary pressure of feeding and being fed upon, which is where the next part of the story starts to feel properly alive. By the time you start asking how Helicoprion hunted, the ancient ocean around it has to come into focus as more than a blurry backdrop. This was the Permian world, stretching from about 298.9 million to 251.9 million years ago, when Earth's land was assembled into the supercontinent Pangaea, and most of the planet's seawater belonged to one enormous ocean basin, Panthalassa, with the Tethys Sea cutting into the tropical side of that world. Marine life in those waters included cephalopods such as nautiloids and ammonoids, alongside many other invertebrates and fishes, which means Helicoprion was not patrolling an empty sea. It was part of a crowded, competitive marine system, already full of prey, rivals, and things that would rather not be eaten. That setting matters because Helicoprion was not a local curiosity, known from one lonely outcrop and nowhere else. Fossils of the animal have been found across America, Australia, Asia, and Europe, which points to a broad marine distribution during the Permian. That does not mean every stretch of sea looked the same, or that Helicoprion drifted lazily through all of them in equal numbers, but it does suggest an animal at home in widely connected marine environments rather than something tied to one tiny, peculiar basin. A predator spread across so much of the Permian Ocean was likely operating in a style that worked well in open marine settings, not just in one sheltered lagoon with a very specific personality. Some of the best-known material comes from the Phosphoria formation of what is now southeastern Idaho, and those rocks are useful because they remind us that the world Helicoprion knew was not arranged for our convenience. The phosphoria is made mainly of chert, carbonaceous mudstone, and phosphorite, with dark mudstones and cherty layers recurring through the sequence. Even if one resists becoming overly dramatic about ancient sea floors, this is not the recipe for a bright postcard sea with crystal water and cheerful coral shallows everywhere. In some of the marine settings where Helicoprion left its mark, the seafloor was muddy, chemically busy, and layered with the residues of a productive ocean that handled life and death on a very large scale. So when we picture Helicoprion hunting, it helps to leave behind the modern nature documentary habit of lighting everything from above with neat blue sunlight and excellent visibility. In many Permian marine settings, especially those represented by dark phosphatic and carbonaceous deposits, the water column likely gave way to deeper, dimmer zones where outlines mattered more than colour, and where a predator would benefit from speed, control, and a mouth capable of turning a brief contact into a secure meal. That does not mean Helicoprion lived permanently in darkness. It means its world had gradients, shelf seas, open water, drifting prey, and less of the tidy aquarium quality our minds like to impose on the past. The shadowy seas part is not just a dramatic title. In many places, it is a fair way to imagine the general feel of the environment. Once that background is in place, the hunting style begins to look less mysterious. A fish with a narrow jaw and a spiraled lower tooth whorl was not built for leisurely grazing, bottom nibbling, or the broad, crushing bite one might expect from a shell specialist. The jaw reconstructions and biomechanical work suggest a bite-feeding predator whose teeth functioned in sequence. The front teeth hooked and dragged prey inward, the middle teeth pierced and cut, and the rear active teeth helped move the prey farther into the mouth. A feeding system like that suits animals encountered in the water column, where the challenge is often not just striking prey, but keeping it from escaping once contact has been made. In other words, Helicoprion was probably not the kind of hunter that won by one dramatic impact alone. It likely won by converting first contact into controlled processing very quickly. That makes a great deal of sense if the main prey included soft-bodied cephalopods. Squid-like animals and the soft parts of shelled cephalopods offer exactly the sort of problem Helicoprion's mouth seems designed to solve. They are mobile, muscular, slippery, and very much inclined to leave if given the chance. The Royal Society summary of the CT-based jaw work notes that Helicoprion likely ate soft-tissued prey such as squid, and the Australian Museum's summary of the later functional analysis explains that soft prey would be trapped effectively in the tooth whorl, while different teeth along that whorl play different roles in capture and transport. Put simply, the animal's best supported menu suggests an active hunter dealing with prey that fought with movement, not one that simply sat on the seafloor waiting to crack shells like nuts by the fireside. Now, active hunter does not necessarily mean a reckless sprinter throwing itself through the sea with all the restraint of a shopping trolley on a hill. The seas of the Permian were already full of predators and fast prey, so efficiency mattered. If Helicoprion targeted cephalopods, then surprise, control, and the ability to keep a prey item aligned with the mouth would have been more important than theatrical violence. The whorl itself suggests repeated, purposeful jaw motion rather than one giant crushing snap. A likely attack may have involved a fast approach, a grab at the prey's body or exposed soft parts, and then a rapid series of smaller opening and closing movements that pulled the victim deeper into the mouth while cutting it. That is a far more controlled style of hunting than the words "circular saw for a jaw" first make you expect. It also sounds, from the prey's point of view, very undesirable indeed. There is another useful point hidden in the prey itself. Cephalopods are not passive food. Even the broader group, across its long history, is defined by mobility, predation, and active movement through marine environments. Modern cephalopods are intelligent, fast, and well-equipped, and although Permian forms were not identical to today's squid and cuttlefish, they belong to that same broader tradition of capable marine animals built for movement and response. A predator specializing on such prey was therefore living in a world where timing mattered. One badly judged strike and dinner would be elsewhere. Helicoprion's jaw design looks very much like the sort of adaptation that evolves when prey are both nutritious and annoyingly unwilling to cooperate. The seas also contained shelled cephalopods such as nautiloids and ammonoids, and those are important not only because they were present, but because they complicate the hunting picture in an interesting way. A predator with Helicoprion's jaw did not necessarily need to smash such prey whole. In the correspondingly large Permian Ocean, cephalopods including nautiloids and ammonoids were part of marine communities, and the jaw studies suggest Helicoprion could handle hard and soft-bodied prey with different strategies. That means a hunt might not always end with a shattered shell. It may instead have involved targeting the exposed animal at the shell opening, trapping and slicing the soft body while leaving much of the shell itself out of the deal. It is less brute force, more selective extraction, which is a wonderfully clinical phrase for a very impolite meal. If that was part of its behaviour, then Helicoprion may have occupied a very useful position in Permian food webs. It was neither a simple shell crusher nor a general-purpose biter in the modern shark mould. It appears to have been a predator that specialised in awkward prey, the sort of animals that are rich in energy but difficult to handle. That kind of specialisation can be powerful in the right environment. A sea full of coiled shells, drifting cephalopods, and various fishes does not reward only the largest mouth. It rewards the mouth that solves a particular problem better than the competition. The combination of a broad marine distribution and a distinctive feeding system strongly suggests Helicoprion had found one such solution and used it well enough to persist across a substantial span of the Permian. There is, however, a difference between saying what Helicoprion likely ate and saying exactly where in the water it hunted. The fossils do not give us a neat trackway through the ocean saying, here it cruised at dawn, here it turned left, here it frightened a cephalopod having a perfectly ordinary afternoon. We have to infer behaviour from anatomy, sediment and distribution, so the most honest picture is this. Helicoprion was probably not a bottom crawler nosing through mud for worms, nor was it likely a reef fish darting among corals like an oversized dental emergency. The jaw, the likely prey, and the broad marine record all point toward a hunter that operated mainly in the water column, whether over shelf seas or in more open marine settings, where encountering soft-bodied nectonic prey would have been part of daily business. That is inference, yes, but it is grounded inference rather than decorative guesswork. And this is where the Permian setting starts to feel properly alive. Picture not one flat, uniform sea, but a connected marine world with broad shelves, deeper basins, drifting currents, suspended life, and the steady movement of animals through layers of water. Somewhere in that system, cephalopods moved with purpose, shelled forms rose and drifted, fishes crossed through dimmer zones, and Helicoprion patrolled as a predator built to turn contact into capture. It did not need the dramatic surface fin of modern shark fiction. It did not need to leap from the water to earn its place. It only needed to be competent, repeated across millions of meals. The fossil record often preserves only the unusual parts, but a predator survives on ordinary success, over and over again. That is what its jaw really tells us. Not that it was monstrous in a theatrical sense, but that it was mechanically reliable in a world where failure was noticed immediately. There is also the matter of competition, which the Permian Ocean would not have lacked. Cartilaginous fishes had already been around for a very long time, and marine ecosystems were not waiting politely for Helicoprion to arrive and explain itself. Any large predator had to share space with other hunters, scavengers, and animals ready to exploit whatever got injured, exposed, or half-eaten. Specialization can be risky, but it can also reduce direct competition. If Helicoprion was especially good at handling soft-bodied cephalopods or extracting edible tissue from shelled prey, then it was not just another mouth in the crowd. It was a mouth with a niche that matters in any food web. The ocean does not hand out long evolutionary careers to predators with no clear advantage. One can also imagine the rhythm of its hunts being less like an endless chase and more like a series of brief opportunities. A drifting shelled cephalopod exposing its body, a squid-like animal crossing into range, a fish turning the wrong way at the wrong time. The narrow jaws snap into place, the front teeth catch, the curved lower whorl begins its work. Smaller repeated movements pull the prey inward, the middle teeth slice, the rear active section continues the transfer. Then the meal disappears into the mouth and the fish moves on, while the sea around it returns to looking calm in that entirely misleading oceanic way. This is not direct observation, of course. It is a reconstruction from function. But it is the kind of reconstruction that stops feeling speculative once you have spent enough time with the jaw. The anatomy keeps pushing you toward action, sequence, and control. And because all deep time stories are haunted a little by what comes later, there is one more thing in the background of these Permian waters. The period would eventually end in the greatest mass extinction known in the history of animal life, with Smithsonian's Ocean History Summary noting that the end Permian event around 252 million years ago devastated marine species on an enormous scale. Helicoprion lived well before that ending, but the sea it hunted in was part of the same long world that would later be broken so badly. I mention that not to turn this into an ending too early, but because it adds a useful kind of weight. These were successful ecosystems, real and functioning and full of life, not merely a prelude to catastrophe. When Helicoprion hunted through them, the ocean was still a working system of prey, pursuit, and adaptation, not yet a ruin in waiting. So by now, I think the most sensible picture is this. Helicoprion was moving through connected Permian seas as a specialised marine predator, probably hunting mostly in the water column, meeting prey that included soft-bodied cephalopods and perhaps the exposed soft parts of shelled forms, and relying on a highly unusual lower jaw whorl to hook, slice and transport food with unusual efficiency. It was not a general-purpose cartoon shark with a strange accessory. It was a product of a specific ocean, a specific menu, and a specific way of feeding that made sense in those long-vanished waters. Which naturally leads to the next difficulty, because once you can picture the hunt well enough to believe it, you begin wanting to see the rest of the hunter more clearly, and that is precisely where the fossil record starts being unhelpful all over again. And this is where the story becomes a little unfair in the most interesting way. We know the jaw of Helicoprion much better than we know the rest of the animal attached to it. The famous tooth whorl survives. Parts of the jaws and some skull cartilage have been detected in rare specimens. But the full body, the whole animal laid out cleanly from snout to tail, still has not turned up in the sort of complete, undeniable condition that would let everyone stop arguing and simply admire the result. Almost all known Helicoprion fossils are tooth whorls, and that is not because the rest of the fish did not matter. It is because the rest of the fish was made largely of cartilage, and cartilage is much less eager to fossilise than bone. The Australian Museum notes that this is exactly why Helicoprion is so difficult to reconstruct from direct evidence, and Smithsonian's summary of the CT work explains that paleontologists spent decades guessing at the whole animal because the hard parts they most needed simply were not there. That creates a very particular kind of fossil frustration. With a dinosaur, if fortune smiles and the sediments cooperate, you may get a respectable skeleton. With Helicoprion, you often get the equivalent of a mouthful of clues and very little else. Imagine trying to reconstruct a violin after finding only the strings and a few fragments of the bridge. You would know you were dealing with something real, something carefully built, something not to be mistaken for a kettle or a shoe, but the full shape would remain irritatingly just out of reach. That is more or less the position paleontologists have been in with Helicoprion. The jaw has become clearer with CT scanning, especially in the specimen known as IMNH 37899, where traces of cartilage around the jaws and skull were preserved in the rock. But even that remarkable fossil did not hand over a complete body. It gave us the head region much more clearly than before, not a full fish posed obligingly for the ages. There is something rather fitting about that in a way. Helicoprion became famous because of the part that was easiest to fossilise and hardest to interpret. The rest of the body did the opposite. It was probably more straightforward in life, but much less cooperative in death. Smithsonian quotes Leif Tapanila pointing out the chondrichthyans are difficult to preserve precisely because their hard anatomy is mostly cartilage, and outside unusual conditions, non-mineralised cartilage decays away and leaves the tougher parts behind. He also notes that older collectors sometimes prepared fossils too aggressively, focusing on the beautiful teeth and accidentally destroying associated cartilage that might have told a fuller story. That is a quietly tragic thought for any paleontologist. Not dramatic sabotage, just lost information, chipped away by enthusiasm. So when you see a modern reconstruction of Helicoprion, sleek and long and shark-like, with a sweeping tail and an impressive posture, it is worth remembering that much of that image is informed inference, not direct portraiture. We are not looking at a body found in one complete slab. We are looking at an educated reconstruction built from the jaw we know, the cartilage we partially know, and comparisons to related eugeniodont fishes that are preserved more completely than Helicoprion itself. A 2024 review on body size and body form proxies makes this point very plainly. It says the tooth whorls of Helicoprion are practically the only remains usually known for the animal, and that reconstructing its size and shape has therefore required proxy comparisons, especially with nearly complete eugeniodonts such as Caseodus, Romerodus, and Fidenia. In other words, when we picture the rest of the fish, we are borrowing from relatives and hoping the family resemblance was strong enough to be useful. That family resemblance is not a ridiculous hope. It is how much of paleontology works when direct evidence runs thin. If one member of a broader group is known mostly from teeth and jaws, while its cousins preserve body outlines, fins and tail proportions, then those cousins become the nearest available guide. The same 2024 review explains that one of the first quantitative body reconstructions of Helicoprion, proposed by Lebedev in 2009, used both extinct eugeniodonts known from nearly complete remains and even odontocetes as proxies, on the assumption that a pelagic predator feeding on fish and cephalopods might converge on a fairly conventional streamlined form. That earlier reconstruction gave Helicoprion an elongated lower jaw and ordinary fusiform fish proportions. Later CT work on the Idaho specimen showed the lower jaw was shorter than that first version envisioned, which then changed body length estimates as well. So even our best reconstructions of the body have been revised as the head became better known. The picture is getting clearer, but it is not fixed in stone, which is an awkward phrase here, because the stone is exactly what is missing. Still, a general image does emerge. Even the cautious literature does not tend to imagine Helicoprion as some dumpy, bottom-hugging creature with a giant dental ornament dragging through the mud like lost luggage. The broad marine distribution of the genus, the feeding mechanics of the jaw, and comparisons with better preserved eugeniodonts all push toward a streamlined, active fish suited to life in open water. Smithsonian notes that the body of Helicoprion is often envisioned as streamlined and shark-like, because that fits a predatory fish, while also stressing that the fossil record itself will be the ultimate test of that idea. That is exactly the right balance. We're not inventing wildly. We're inferring responsibly, but we are still inferring. The confidence belongs mostly to the general direction, not to every fin angle and contour line in museum art. This is one of the subtler pleasures of the animal, I think. The more we learn about the jaw, the more the missing body starts to matter. Early on, the tooth whorl was such a spectacular problem that it dominated everything. Where did it go? How did it work? What did it cut? But once those questions begin to settle, a new absence becomes visible. The mouth is no longer the whole mystery. Now the body steps forward by not being there. What was the exact shape of the skull? How broad was the trunk? How deep through the body was the animal in profile? Where exactly did the dorsal fin sit? How tall and forked was the tail? Did the proportions resemble one relative more than another, or was Helicoprion doing something more distinct than we have yet realised? These are not trivial details. They affect how we imagine its swimming, acceleration, manoeuvring, and even the kinds of prey encounters it handled best. The difficulty becomes even clearer when body size enters the conversation, because size is one of the first things everyone wants to know, and one of the easiest things to say too confidently. Public reconstructions have often described a moderate specimen around 13 feet long, with larger individuals potentially reaching 25 feet, based on scaling from known jaw material. The Royal Society's 2013 release used exactly those figures when discussing the Idaho Museum's planned full-bodied reconstruction. But the more recent 2024 review treats all such estimates with healthy caution. It lays out how older reconstructions scaled total length from tooth whorl diameter through assumptions about head length and conventional fish proportions, yielding ranges around 7.0 to 11.2 meters for very large individuals, and then explains that later CT work on the jaw suggested a shorter head-to-whorl ratio, bringing one large estimate down to roughly 7 meters total length instead. That does not mean Helicoprion was small. It means that even basic questions like how long was it depend on a chain of assumptions, and every assumption is more fragile when the body itself is missing. That is a useful corrective, because prehistoric animals have a way of growing in the imagination when the fossil record gets patchy. It is easy to take a whorl, scale it against a streamlined fish body, and arrive at a grand, intimidating silhouette that looks wonderful on a poster. It is harder to admit that the poster is still partly a hypothesis, wearing very confident skin. The 2024 review is unusually direct about this. It says that body size and body form estimates in taxa like Helicoprion are intrinsically uncertain when complete specimens are lacking, and that proxy-based reconstructions should be treated as very tentative until stronger evidence appears. I rather appreciate the honesty of that. It does not make the animal less interesting. It makes it more real. Real science is not a series of perfect answers. It is a series of increasingly disciplined approximations. There is also a quiet irony in the relationship between the head and the body here. The jaw is so distinctive that one is tempted to imagine the rest of the fish must have been equally eccentric. Yet that is probably not true. Extreme specialization often lives inside otherwise sensible anatomy. A normal enough pelagic body paired with a very unusual feeding system makes more functional sense than a fish that is bizarre from nose to tail for no good reason. Smithsonian's coverage reflects this mood rather well. It notes that the body is usually imagined as streamlined and predatory, but also warns that the rest of the appearance remains conjectural. That is probably the safest picture to keep in mind tonight. Not an all-over monster assembled for theatrical effect, but an animal whose body may have been relatively conventional for an active marine hunter, while the jaw was where evolution spent its more dramatic budget. And that, in turn, changes the emotional feel of Helicoprion a little. Once you stop expecting every part of it to be strange, the animal becomes more believable. The missing body no longer feels like an inconvenience to the imagination. It feels like an invitation to restraint. Perhaps the fish looked at first glance almost ordinary in motion. Perhaps from a distance it read simply as a large, efficient predator of the Permian Sea. Only up close, only at the mouth, did the true peculiarity reveal itself. There is something unsettling about that possibility. It is one thing to notice danger from far away. It is another thing to discover that the danger was hidden inside what seemed to be an otherwise sensible fish. Of course, one should not let imagination run too far in one direction either. The absence of a complete body means there may yet be surprises waiting. Smithsonian quotes Tapanila, hoping that one day a mine in East Idaho might yield a Helicoprion body associated with a tooth whorl, and that remark captures the present state of things perfectly. We do not need 1,000 more whorls. We need the rest of the fish. A body fossil with clear fin placement, trunk depth, tail structure, and maybe even traces of skin or muscle profile would do more for our understanding of Helicoprion than several additional debates about saw analogies ever could. The jaw mystery was one century-long problem. The body is the next one, only quieter. There is a broader lesson here about fossil fame. The features that make an animal famous are not always the features that make it scientifically easy to understand. In fact, the opposite is often true. Helicoprion's tooth whorl made it unforgettable, but it also distracted attention from the fact that the rest of the organism remained almost invisible. We fell in love with the strangest surviving structure and then had to spend years relearning the obvious. A jaw belongs to a body, and a body shapes an ecology. How long could it cruise? How quickly could it turn? Did it rely on bursts of speed or steady pursuit? Was it a tireless open water traveller or a more measured hunter that depended on the right encounter? Those questions are body questions, not just tooth questions, and they remain less settled than the whorl itself. It is also worth saying that the missing body does not make the science weak. It simply changes the kind of confidence we can honestly have. We can be strongly confident that Helicoprion was a cartilaginous fish, with a lower jaw tooth whorl and a specialised feeding mechanism for soft-bodied prey. We can be reasonably confident that it was some kind of active marine predator with a generally streamlined body based on proxies and ecology. We should be much less confident about exact fin proportions, exact total length in the largest individuals, and every polished contour in every artistic restoration. That is not a flaw in paleontology. It is one of its deepest disciplines. Knowing which parts of the picture are evidence and which parts are still pencil marks. And perhaps that is why this animal lingers so well in the mind. We know enough for it to feel real, but not enough for it to become ordinary. The jaw is no longer a nonsense object. The diet is no longer a complete mystery. The habitat is beginning to take shape, yet the whole fish still refuses to stand entirely still for us. Some part of it remains out in the dim water, beyond the circle of certainty, and that has a way of making the imagination work harder while also behaving a little better. One cannot simply draw any body at all and call it solved. The absent skeleton keeps us modest. So for now, the best way to picture Helicoprion is with two thoughts held together at once. First, it was a real animal, not just a famous tooth spiral, and it probably had the body of an efficient marine hunter, not a lumbering curiosity. Second, we have not fully found that body, and until we do, every reconstruction from neck to tail remains a carefully managed guess built from relatives, measurements, and restraint. That combination of clarity and incompleteness is not a disappointment. It is what makes the story feel alive. We are still in the middle of meeting the fish properly. And once you accept that, the next part of the story becomes even more interesting, because if the body remains partly hidden, the lineage around it does not. Helicoprion was not alone in its strangeness. It belonged to a broader family of cartilaginous experimenters, and some of its relatives help explain how a mouth like this became possible in the first place. One of the easiest mistakes to make with Helicoprion is to treat it as a solitary oddball, a single prehistoric fish that wandered into evolutionary history, grew a ridiculous mouth, and then vanished before anyone could file the paperwork. But that is not really the case. Helicoprion was strange, certainly, though by now that word is starting to feel almost affectionate. Still, it was not alone in its strangeness. It belonged to a broader extinct group of cartilaginous fishes called eugeniodonts, and that whole group was full of experiments in teeth, jaws and feeding styles that make modern shark mouths look almost conservative. The CT-based work on Helicoprion places it among holocephalans, the deep branch of cartilaginous fishes whose only living representatives are chimeras, and later reviews of holocephalan evolution likewise treat these Paleozoic forms as part of that broader stem, rather than as true sharks in the modern sense. That distinction matters more than it may seem at first. Calling Helicoprion a shark is understandable shorthand. It had a streamlined fish body, it lived in the sea, and it certainly occupied a predatory role that feels shark-like in the broad cinematic sense. But evolution is not a matter of vibes. The details of the skull and jaw suspension revealed by CT scanning showed that Helicoprion carried features associated with early holocephalans, including an autodiastylic jaw suspension and a jaw arrangement that links it more closely to the line leading toward chimeras than to the line of modern sharks and rays. So when we talk about a family of strange cartilage hunters, we're not really talking about weird sharks so much as a vanished radiation of shark-like holocephalans that explored the feeding possibilities of the Paleozoic sea with remarkable enthusiasm, and what a family it was. The broader Eugeniodont story is one of repeated experimentation with symphyseal dentition, meaning tooth systems concentrated along the midline of the jaws. In the edistoid branch of that group, this led to some of the most unusual cutting arrangements ever seen in vertebrate mouths. The 2018 review on late Paleozoic symphyseal dentitions describes Helicoprion and Adestus as opposite-end members of specialization among these edistoids. It also discusses other genera such as Toxoprion, Campiloprion, Agassizodus, and Helicoprion, all of them variations on the broader theme that if a normal row of teeth worked fairly well, a highly modified row of teeth arranged in a more intimidating fashion might work even better for a very specific job. That review also notes that the slicing symphyseal dentition of edistoids may have arisen in response to abundant pelagic cephalopod prey in the late Paleozoic, which is a wonderfully practical explanation for what otherwise looks like a very elaborate series of dental decisions. There is something deeply reassuring about that. Not the cephalopods, who would probably object to the whole arrangement, but the logic. It is easy to stare at Helicoprion and imagine evolution briefly losing all adult supervision. Yet when you put it back into its family context, the world stops looking like a freak accident and starts looking like one branch of a larger conversation. Different Eugeniodont lineages were solving related feeding problems in different ways. Some favoured slicing dentitions, some retained more crushing pavement-like teeth, some developed paired or opposing whorls, some built larger spirals, some stayed closer to simpler dental batteries. What looks absurd in isolation begins to look systematic once the relatives arrive. Take Adestus, for instance, another famous and deeply unsettling member of the broader group. Unlike Helicoprion, which had its great spiral whorl in the lower jaw, Adestus carried opposing curved tooth blades in both upper and lower jaws. The same 2018 review summarises that arrangement and notes that Adestus likely used those segmented, shedding blades in a slicing action very different from Helicoprion's inward rolling lower jaw mechanism. So even within the same broad world of symphyseal cutting dentitions, there was no single approved design. One lineage built a compact spiral supported within the lower jaw, another developed long opposing blades that seemed to have cut prey in a different motion altogether. It is less one invention repeated endlessly than a small workshop full of related prototypes. Then there are the less famous names, which deserve better public relations simply for being so wonderfully odd. Campiloprion, Toxoprion, Agassizodus and Helicoprion all appear in discussions of edistoid symphyseal dentitions as further examples of how widely this family played with the same general idea. These genera didn't all carry identical whorls, and they did not all feed in exactly the same way, but together they show that the midline jaw apparatus was not some one-time curiosity. It was an evolutionary zone of experimentation. Teeth could be large or smaller, more open or more tightly curved, shed differently or not at all, arranged for slicing softer tissues or for other prey-handling tasks. Once you see that, Helicoprion begins to feel less alone and more like the most famous representative of a strange but genuine tradition. There is another branch of the family that matters just as much, though for a different reason. Not every Eugeniodont was built around dramatic slicing whorls. The review notes that the slicing edistoids were descended from more crushing tooth plates, and it specifically mentions Cassiodonts, such as Cassiodus, as durophagus predators with crushing teeth, in contrast to Helicoprion and Adestus, which specialised more on slicing softer tissues. This is important because it means the family was not simply obsessed with turning every meal into a cutting exercise. Different lineages within the broader group occupied different feeding roles. Some were more shell-handling crushers, others were soft tissue specialists. The family resemblance lay in the cartilage, the skull architecture, and the jaw traditions, not in one rigid diet or one single mechanical solution. Cassiodus is particularly useful in this story because, unlike Helicoprion, the cassiodontid line includes forms preserved well enough to tell us more about body shape. The 2024 paper cautioning against overconfident body size estimates for Helicoprion points out that reconstructions of Helicoprion have relied heavily on comparison with nearly complete eugenodonts such as Cassiodus, Romeridus, and Fadinia. That alone tells you how valuable these relatives are. They are not just names on the family tree, they are the reason we can draw the rest of Helicoprion with any seriousness at all. When the body of the star specimen remains elusive, the cousins have to step in and lend their outlines, and those cousins suggest a family of active, streamlined marine hunters, rather than sluggish curiosities with fancy mouths. The same 2018 review describes these fishes as pelagic predators, capable of high-speed dashes, and it explicitly contrasts gyrophagous forms like Cassiodus with slicing specialists like Helicoprion and Edestus, while still placing them all within the same broader predatory framework. That matters for the emotional picture. The term cartilage hunter begins to feel exactly right. These were not ornamental museum oddities drifting through history and embarrassment. They were working predators in the water column, moving quickly, targeting cephalopods and other prey, and doing so with a family range of jaw systems that modern fish simply do not preserve. Romeridus helps reinforce that image. While our best direct information about it in this search set comes second-hand through summaries rather than the full monograph, the more recent literature repeatedly treats Romeridus as one of the more complete casiodontid proxies for Helicoprion's overall shape, and the 2024 body size review specifically names it among the nearly complete eugenodonts used in reconstruction work. That indicates something important even if it does not give us every detail of its fins. The family contained forms preserved well enough to support comparisons, and those comparisons consistently point toward a fusiform, pelagic body plan rather than anything bottom-heavy or cumbersome. In other words, the broader lineage around Helicoprion was already adapted to open water predation, which helps make sense of why its own jaw became such a specialised prey-handling machine. Fadinia matters for a similar reason. It is one of the relatively complete eugenodonts used as a body proxy, and it appears in discussions of the group's anatomy and survival beyond the Permian. The 2008 report on Lower Triassic eugenodontids from Western Canada describes the group as diverse in the early Triassic, similar in size and morphology to their Paleozoic predecessors, and argues that they were not simply wiped out at the Permian boundary with no continuation at all. That gives the family a longer shadow than one might expect. They were not a brief burst of experimental teeth that immediately failed. They persisted, diversified, and in some cases survived the end Permian catastrophe, at least for a short time into the Triassic. A lineage that can do that deserves a little more respect than the phrase "weird fossil fish" usually grants it. There is something quietly moving about that persistence. We often imagine evolutionary experiments as either triumphant winners or quick dead ends. But many lineages are neither. They last a long time, spread widely, fill their niches well, and then eventually disappear when the world changes or their particular solutions no longer fit. Eugenodonts seem to belong to that middle category. They were successful enough to be globally distributed in marine deposits, diverse enough to include multiple tooth styles and body forms, and resilient enough that at least some members continued into the early Triassic. Helicoprion, in that context, was not a temporary fluke. It was one successful branch of a durable Paleozoic tradition. And yet, despite all of that, the family still feels alien because there is no modern equivalent in the same style. Living chimeras are the nearest survivors of the broader holocephalan line, but they are not simply mini Helicoprions waiting in deep water with better manners. Smithsonian's recent summary puts it nicely by calling Helicoprion and its relatives a diverse and long-lived group of predatory ratfish with no modern counterparts. That is worth holding on to. The comparison to chimeras is phylogenetic, not visual. It tells us about ancestry and branching, not about one-to-one resemblance. The family of strange cartilage hunters was doing something the modern ocean no longer offers in quite the same way, which is why names like Ornithoprion become so enjoyable once you meet them. Even though the available search results here are less authoritative for detailed use than I would like, Ornithoprion is broadly recognised in the literature as another eugeniodont, with a highly modified lower jaw and very unusual skull proportions, preserved from Pennsylvanian black shales. It is often treated as one of the better-known Paleozoic holocephalans precisely because more of the head region survived than in many relatives. I will keep the claim modest, because I do not want to lean harder on weaker sources than the evidence justifies, but even at that restrained level it helps illustrate the point. The family around Helicoprion included more than one kind of cranial experimentation. Teeth were not the only thing getting imaginative. That broader cranial context also helps explain why the group can look so unfamiliar, while still being internally coherent. The CT study of Helicoprion showed a jaw suspension pattern and cranial arrangement that made sense within Paleozoic euchondrocephalans, and the 2024 review of holocephalan evolution emphasises that the assembly of the holocephalan body plan happened in stages across many extinct relatives, rather than appearing fully formed in modern chimeras. Put differently, the family tree includes many side branches that preserve combinations of features no living fish now carries together. Helicoprion and its kin occupied one of those extinct combinations. Active pelagic hunters, with unusual symphyseal dentitions and early holocephalan jaw architecture. It is a combination that sounds improbable only because modern oceans edited it out. There is also a practical ecological lesson hiding in all this family history. A group does not generate multiple distinct cutting and crushing dentitions unless there are several profitable ways to make a living. The 2018 review explicitly links these dental systems to pelagic cephalopod prey, noting that both crushing predators like Casiodus and slicing specialists like Helicoprion and Adestus could have fed on the abundant shelled cephalopods of the Upper Paleozoic, albeit in different ways. That means the family was not only diverse in form, it was partitioning the same general prey landscape through different methods. One lineage may have cracked and crushed more directly, another may have sliced soft tissues, another may have captured and sheared differently again. Once you see the family as a set of feeding strategies, rather than merely a list of weird names, the whole lineage comes alive. And perhaps that is the nicest correction this part of the story offers. It rescues Helicoprion from the category of isolated freak. Isolated freaks are fun for a minute, but they do not teach you much beyond the fact that nature can be unruly. Families teach you patterns. Relatives show you what is inherited, what is novel, what is repeated, and what is pushed to extremes. Helicoprion is much more informative when you place it among other eugeniodonts, because then you can see which parts of its anatomy are family traits and which are its own dramatic exaggerations. The cartilage-based skeleton, the early holocephalan affinities, the predatory marine body, the willingness to use the jaw midline as a place for serious dental business, all of that belongs to the broader family story. The fully closed spiral whorl in the lower jaw is where Helicoprion becomes especially itself. There is even a certain comfort in discovering that prehistoric oddities often come in clusters. We like to think of the natural world as mostly sensible with occasional lapses into eccentricity. The fossil record suggests something a bit richer. Once a lineage opens an evolutionary possibility, it often explores several versions before settling, diversifying, or disappearing. Eugeniodonts seem to have done exactly that with symphyseal dentitions. One branch made scissors, another made saws, another kept more crushing teeth, another blended traits in ways that now require long afternoons and careful diagrams to appreciate fully. It is almost endearing, provided one was not a cephalopod in their neighbourhood. And all of this feeds directly back into why Helicoprion puzzled scientists for so long. A family this unusual does not make interpretation easy. When the only obvious fossil is a tooth whorl, and you know there are relatives with very different whorls, opposing blades, crushing plates, and partly known skulls, the temptation to place structures in the wrong context becomes understandable. Family resemblance helps, but it can also complicate things. Is this whorl behaving like a destus? Is it more like a caesodont jaw element? Is it a unique specialization within Helicoprionidae? Sorting that out required not just more fossils, but better ways of looking inside the fossils that already existed. So once you have met the family properly, the next step almost suggests itself. The mystery of Helicoprion was never solved by a single clever guess. It was solved because paleontologists compared relatives, refined classifications, scanned old specimens, and slowly learned to read the anatomy that had been sitting inside the rock the whole time. The family gave the problem its context. The technology gave the problem a new answer. And that is where the story begins to turn from evolutionary oddity into scientific detective work. The puzzle of Helicoprion's tooth whorl was not solved in one glorious moment by a scientist dramatically brushing off a fossil and announcing the truth to an astonished room. It was solved the slower way, which is usually the real way. One uncertain interpretation gave way to another. A good specimen waited in a museum longer than anyone expected. New technology arrived. Old assumptions were tested against better evidence. And little by little, one of paleontology's strangest long-running arguments started to close. The reason it took so long is simple enough. The most obvious fossil was a spiral of teeth, but a spiral of teeth by itself is not a whole animal. It is a very loud clue attached to a very quiet body. And for more than a century, that clue was almost all anyone had. The story begins in 1899, when Alexander Kopinski described the first well-known Helicoprion fossil from rocks near Krasnoufimpsk in Russia. He recognized that the spiral structure belonged to a prehistoric fish, and he named the animal accordingly. But naming a fossil and understanding it are not the same task. Kopinski knew he was looking at something real and important, yet he did not know where the tooth whorl belonged on the fish. He suggested that it projected from the snout and curled backward over the head, with the teeth pointing outward like some kind of weapon. It was not an absurd suggestion in the sense of being careless. It was an honest attempt to make sense of an anatomy that had no clear modern comparison and almost no surrounding skeleton to guide it. Still, it was wrong, and that first wrong answer would not be the last. What followed was more than a century of proposals, revisions, and rather imaginative anatomical placements. Scientists and illustrators tried the whorl in the upper jaw, in the lower jaw, on the snout, on fins, near the tail, and even deep in the throat. By the time modern researchers looked back over the history of the problem, they could show an entire gallery of reconstructions that now seem almost surreal. Yet there was method in the confusion. Everyone was trying to solve the same practical problem. If this spiral of teeth was functional, then it had to sit somewhere on the fish where those teeth could do something useful. The difficulty was that cartilaginous fish preserve poorly. Their skeletons are made mostly of cartilage, not dense bone, so most of the body tends to vanish while the more durable teeth survive. Helicoprion was therefore known mainly from the very feature that made it hardest to interpret. That is the first important part of how the mystery was solved. People often picture the history as a line of silly guesses ending in one correct answer, but the real story is more disciplined than that. Scientists were not merely inventing odd placements for amusement. They were testing possibilities against incomplete evidence. Some proposals failed because the whorl looked too fragile for the position suggested. Some failed because the geometry would have made feeding awkward or useless. Others kept returning because, even if they were not perfect, they at least put the teeth somewhere near a mouth. By the mid-20th century, the broad direction of the answer was improving. The wildest external placements were losing ground, and the idea that the whorl belonged somewhere in the jaw was becoming harder to dismiss. The puzzle was not solved yet, but the range of acceptable nonsense was getting smaller, which is often how science begins to behave when it is finally closing in. A major turning point came not with a brand new discovery in the field, but with an older specimen that had already been sitting in institutional collections. In 1966, Sven Erik Bendix Almgreen described a Helicoprion fossil from the Waterloo phosphate mine near Montpelier, Idaho, a specimen that had been found years earlier and was unusual because it preserved not just the tooth whorl, but also bits of cartilage from the jaw and skull. Bendix Almgreen saw that this specimen mattered. He suggested that the whorl fit at the end of an elongate lower jaw, which was already a much more useful direction than the old snout weapon idea. But he also thought the specimen had been crushed and disarticulated so badly that a full reconstruction was impossible. In other words, he moved the problem forward without being able to finish it. That may not sound dramatic, but it is exactly the kind of step that later breakthroughs depend on. Someone has to recognise that the specimen matters before a later generation can ask more of it. And then the fossil waited. That is another part of the story people do not always expect. Important specimens do not always become useful immediately. Sometimes they sit in drawers and cabinets until a new question is asked, or until somebody with the right kind of patience notices that old material may still have more to say. In this case, student Jesse Pruitt began asking questions about the Idaho Museum of Natural History's Helicoprion material, especially about whether the coiled tooth row was really a natural feature of the living animal or some post-mortem distortion. That line of curiosity mattered. It shifted the focus from repeating old reconstructions to checking the physical reality of the fossil itself. Pruitt, Leif Tapanila, and their colleagues revisited the material, especially the specimen Bendix Almgreen had highlighted, and decided that the best way forward was to look inside it rather than simply at its surface. That is where the old mystery met new technology. The real breakthrough came with CT scanning. The team used high-resolution scans to create three-dimensional virtual reconstructions of the fossil, allowing them to visualize structures still buried inside the rock. This was the decisive change. Earlier researchers had been limited to what they could expose physically, and exposing fragile fossils too aggressively can destroy information rather than reveal it. CT technology let the team inspect the hidden anatomy without carving away the clues. The 2013 biology letter study reported the first three-dimensional images showing the tooth whorl occupying the entire mandibular arch and supported along the midline of the lower jaw. That one result did several things at once. It showed that the whorl belonged inside the mouth. It showed that it was integrated with the lower jaw rather than hanging from some external structure. And it greatly reduced the appeal of all those older hypotheses involving snouts, fins, tails, or throat ornaments. The fish had been carrying the spiral where a feeding apparatus belonged all along. The new scans also corrected the shape of the jaw itself. Earlier long-jawed reconstructions had imagined the whorl at the front of an extended lower jaw, almost like a strange outboard attachment. The CT data indicated something more compact and more mechanically coherent. National Geographic's summary of the research reported that the tooth whorl completely filled the lower jaw, with the jaw joint sitting right behind it, and jaw cartilage buttressing the structure on either side. The Royal Society's release described the teeth as located within the jaw and producing a rolling back, slicing mechanism. That is a very different animal from the older posters and murals. Instead of a fish awkwardly carrying a spiral at the tip of a long jaw, the new reconstruction showed a mouth built around the spiral as an integrated functional unit. The whorl was no longer an accessory, it was the jaw's central business. What I particularly like about this stage of the story is that the solution did not just say where the whorl was, it also explained why so many earlier ideas had felt unsatisfying. A spiral sitting on the snout is spectacular, but it is mechanically awkward. A tail ornament looks memorable, but it does not explain why the structure is made of tooth crowns. A throat device solves one problem only by creating several new ones. Once the whorl was placed in the lower jaw and shown to be supported by surrounding cartilages, the fossil suddenly became more logical than theatrical. The mystery shifted from where could such a thing possibly go, to how exactly did this jaw work during feeding. That is a sign that a scientific problem has matured. You stop arguing over the location of the object and start asking about the behaviour of the animal. In Helicoprion's case, the best answer was no longer a weird placement. It was a functional mouth. Even then, the puzzle was not completely finished. Solving the position of the whorl was a major victory. But position is not the same thing as mechanism. The next step came in the 2015 functional morphology study.